So the third method of positioning grid items on the grid is by actually naming entire areas. So let's see how we can do that. So let's again start by commenting out this code here so that we can again start from scratch. Or actually not really from scratch, but simply by using this code that we had in the first example. Okay. So method number 3 is to actually name grid areas. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we simply use the grid template areas property. And now this is probably gonna look really weird to you, okay? Because I remember that when I first saw this, I found it really strange the way it worked, okay? But anyway, this is how we name grid areas. So we write a couple of strings, and in there we basically give each grid cell a name, okay? So in our case, we have a 4x4 grid. So in the first string, we give the first 4 grid cells 4 names, okay? And what are our first 4 cells? Well, it's this, 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 and this, right? And all of them are for the header. So let's give them a name, and I'm simply gonna call them head. And this is how it works. So head, 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 and head. Okay, so the 4 cells will be called head. And that's because we want the header to be in all of these 4 cells. So basically, this first string defines the first row of our grid. Okay, now we hit enter, then we come here to this exact place. And actually it doesn't have to be this exact place, but I like to do it like this because it's easier to see. And then we need to call the next 4 cells, okay? So this one, this one, this one, and this one. So let's call these 3 here box, and then the last one side. Okay, and so in here I like to use a really small name, like as small as possible, so that it doesn't take too much space up here in the declaration, and so that it's also not too hard to write, because there's usually a lot of repetition. So you see box, 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 and then the last one is side, right? And so basically this template area here, this creates a representation with text of how our final layout is gonna look like. So what do we have here in the third row? So basically these 3 cells. Well, all we have here is the main. So main, main, and main, and then on the side we have the sidebar, right? So these 2 here will be the sidebar, these 3 will be the main content, and these 3 will be small boxes individually, right? And then down here, which is the last row, and so it's the last string, we have 4 times the footer. So let's simply use foot here. So foot, 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 and foot. And that's it. So that is our template string. Then at the end, don't forget the semicolon. Okay, so again, this looks a bit weird, I know, but this is actually a great way of placing items on the grid, because it's really simple. Once you have this declaration here finished, then all you have to do is to actually place the items like this. So let's first delete all of this here so that we go back to our initial state. Like this, okay? And so yeah, so this is how it looks like without any placement whatsoever. And so let's now position the header. So remember this grid area property that I showed you before? Back then we used it to put the column start, the column end, the row start, and the row end. So these 4 numbers. Remember that? Right in the first or second lecture of this section, I think. But there is actually another way of using this property here, and that is called for the template areas that we defined here. Okay? So remember that for the header, we called it head. And so all I have to do now is to write head without any quotes here, and that's it. So it places this item here on this entire area that I defined to be the head. So imagine that I put something else here like side, for example, then let's see what's happened. Okay, so now it only occupies these 3 cells here because the head is only in these 3. Okay? That makes sense, right? So let's put it back to head here. And so now you will see it going back. Okay. Then these boxes here, they're actually automatically positioned, such as before. And so let's go to the sidebar. And it's very simple again. We don't have to think like we had to think with the other methods. All we have to do now is to say the name of the area with the side. And so here we are again with the sidebar exactly where it should be. Right? So perfect. The same thing here, main, and the same thing here. And it's actually just foot. And that's it. So our layout is complete again. So you see that this is like a completely different philosophy. So in this case, we first think about the layout, so where all of these items should be placed, and then all we have to do is to give the names here to each of the items. While with the 2 other methods that we did before, we used the names of the lines or the numbers, which is quite similar. And then for each of these items here, we had to think where to position them, right? Now, when we create this template area definition here, we need to be careful and create a complete representation of our grid. Okay, so if it's a bit different at all, then all of this is not going to work. So let me, for example, just delete this here. And you will see that it's not working then at all anymore, right? So this looks just like really weird, okay? So it's not working at all. And just because I didn't really fill up all the 16 cells that we have, right? So we have 4 columns, 4 rows, when 4 times 4 makes 16. And so in here, I have to have 16 names, okay? And so let's go back to what we had. Now, another thing that we can do here with this template areas is to actually leave empty cells. And all we have to do for that is to instead just delete it, is to put a dot. So let's see what happens then. Well, what happens is that this box here then moves up to this empty cell. And that's because we didn't really position these boxes here, right? And so that's what happens. So if you really wanted to leave this empty, we would have to then place these 3 boxes here. So let's actually do that. That shouldn't be all too hard. So it's small box 1, 2, and 3. And we can probably do this all with the same selector. So 2. And then the number 3. And so grid area should be box. So let's take a look at that. And that's actually not quite what we want, because the template area definition is not really correct. Okay, so what we say here is that this area here should all be the same, which in fact it is not. So let's actually, to make this better, or to make it correct actually, give this different names. And so what we have to do now here, grid area should be box 1. So let's get rid of that. So number 2 for this one. Oh, what's that? And number 3 for this one. And yeah. So now it's correct. Now everything is correct, right? And we have this empty cell here like we defined. And we can put another one, for example, here if we wanted. And then the header would just span these 2 cells. And of course, that's entirely possible. We can have empty cells in our grids without any problem. Okay, so if that's the layout that we're looking for, then CSS Grid gives us the total flexibility to do exactly like that. All right, and that's actually it. So this is all I had to tell you about the naming grid areas and how to position grid items on the grid. So these are the 3 methods, and they can be used in different situations. For example, this one here with the template areas, I think it's really great for smaller layouts like this one. So when I have to build a small layout, then I would always use something like this, because I think it's really straightforward. Okay, so keep that in mind. For a small, simple layout, I would say something like 4x4, 5x5, then it's completely fine to do it like this. But if we have a huge layout like a complete page, maybe with 12 columns or 15 columns and 10 or 15 lines, then it becomes very unpractical to write out all of these areas. It's much simpler to then simply name the grid lines and do it like this, like I showed you in the previous lecture. But for small layouts, again, I think this one here is perfect. Okay, and that wraps up this project. Okay, so project number 2. And I think that you already did a huge progress. So actually, you already know many of the important stuff about CSS grids. You're already ready to build some simple layouts using grids. And that's fantastic, right? Now there's some more advanced stuff to learn, of course, and we're gonna do that throughout the rest of the section. But for now, it's great that you've come this far, that you made all this progress, and maybe you can even try to build something right now. Maybe just a small example to see if you got all of this and if you really understood it, okay?